COVID-19 and Danish mink farms, a case study on intensive animal farms and zoonotic disease. Intensive animal farming is a method of raising large numbers of animals in confined spaces. Under these conditions, zoonotic diseases can spread rapidly, endangering not only the health of farm animals, but also of humans, wild animals, and the environment. In November 2020, Danish researchers detected a new variant of COVID-19, which had mutated among mink on fur farms, and then reemerged to infect at least 12 humans. As we will see, the government of Denmark responded to this emerging public health threat in a way that was overly simplistic, ignored the complexity of the overall industry and system, and led to disastrous unintended consequences. This presentation will build up to a recommended policy plan that we believe should have been implemented instead.
Mink are semi-aquatic mammals related to creatures such as otters and weasels. The system map illustrates breeding and intensive farming process for the mink fur farm industry in Denmark, as well as its major stakeholders. All mink farmers are represented in national and international political affairs by the Danish Fur Breeders Association. The DFBA also owns Copenhagen Fur, the association's sales organization and auction house. Copenhagen Fur conducts the sale of approximately 40% of the world's mink skin production. In the interest of maintaining quality pelt production, all mink fur farmers must report their breeding females and quality indicators such as animal size, behavior, health, and pelt quality to Copenhagen Fur preceding mink culling. Interestingly, this is not subject to European Union nor Danish regulation. The first photo depicts the living standards of the mink in Denmark. They live in close quarters with one another in cages that are about twice their length for most of their lifetime. The photo on the right shows one of the health indicators in effect. Inspectors poke a stick into the mink cage. Minks that are willing to approach the stick indicate that they are well adjusted and in good health. The photo on the left shows mink being culled. As you can see, mink fur farm workers wear little to no personal protective equipment, creating a window for the transmission of disease between humans and animals. The picture on the right displays Copenhagen Fur graded and labeled mink pelts that are ready for sale. Denmark's COVID epidemic was driven by Danish ski resort travelers returning from northern Italy and Tyrol, Austria, where an estimated 70% of Danish COVID cases have been connected to. At about April 2020, 2 mink farms in Denmark reported COVID cases amongst their minks, which researchers had deduced to have occurred through human-animal transition through infected mink farm workers. COVID spread rapidly through mink populations. In addition, as the virus jumped from humans to mink, a new variant occurred within the mink, dubbed Cluster 5. Cluster 5 could also jump from mink back to humans. Initially, in order to suppress the spread of COVID amongst mink, farms separated and culled infected mink groups, but the efforts were not effective in quelling the spread of COVID to healthy minks. On November 4, 2020, the Denmark Prime Minister ordered the culling of all 17 million minks, fearing that a widespread circulation of the mink variant amongst humans would reduce the effectiveness of oncoming vaccines. This was a devastating measure for the thousands of people in Denmark who were mink farm operators, workers, or involved in some type of mink-related business. Because there is no legal basis to cull all of Denmark's entire mink population, a political crisis ensued involving the resignation of the Prime Minister's cabinet members, and calls also mounted for the Prime Minister's own resignation. In December 2020, zombie mink started rising out of their mass graves, pushed up by gases released during their decomposition. This led to fears of environmental contamination of nearby water sources, which in some locations were a mere 200 meters away from mass graves.
This excerpt was taken from a Vanity Fair article from a couple who ran a mink fur farm. Lars Holten Hansen spent the first Saturday in November in his barn in northern Denmark, killing the mink that his family had raised for 2 generations. His partner, Rena Skoth, who designs jewelry and other items with fur from their animals when she isn't overseeing the breeding, was on the phone trying to explain between sobs what it was like to comply with the Danish government's order to exterminate their herd. People keep asking me how it feels as a mink breeder to have this happen, she said, but I'm not a mink breeder anymore. As of last week, I'm only a mink killer. We created a policy field map to represent the landscape of stakeholders. This table depicts stakeholders on the international, the national, and the regional levels, with solid arrows denoting the flow of information and influence, and dotted arrows denoting the flow of monetary funds. Beginning on the next slide, we will actually narrow down our focus to a smaller number of priority stakeholders. For the moment, the main takeaway from this diagram is that there are a large number of stakeholders involved, and the relationships between them are many and complex.
Here in this influence versus interest, we have narrowed it down to our 9 priority stakeholders. The Danish Prime Minister and National Ministries has the highest influence and interest as they were the ones to order the culling, which unfortunately most directly affected the Danish mink farmers and workers who had the lowest influence but the highest interest. And we have other stakeholders such as European Union, CDC and OSHA, Staten Serum Institute, the Tripartite, Copenhagen Fur Auction House, apparel retailers, waste retailers, the Danish general public, and international fur markets.
3 of those 9 stakeholders we identified have an international level of influence: the Tripartite, the European Union and its sub-agencies, and the international fur markets. The main takeaway here is that some of the stakeholders on the international level have fairly opposing priorities. While the Tripartite and the EU have an interest in controlling the public health risk through a combination of control measures, the global fur market has a stronger stake in preserving Denmark's fur industry.
The priority stakeholders at the national stage are represented by 2 government entities, that is, Staten Serum Institute, Denmark's infectious disease research sector, and Denmark's Prime Minister and her ministries. A risk assessment issued by the SSI on November 3, 2020, suggested a pause in all ongoing production of mink fur during the COVID pandemic. The very next day, the government issued an order to cull all of the nation's mink. Obviously, these solutions oppose that of Copenhagen Fur, which seeks to preserve the mink fur industry by minimizing culling to COVID-infected mink.
The priority stakeholders at the regional level are the Danish mink farmers and employees, the fur industry, and the Danish general public. When the farmers received the order that they were to cull all their mink, they were shocked and broken, but conceded to the government even with the knowledge that they would not be able to return from this. The public was outraged at the unethical decision that their government had made, along with the fur industry, who depends on the high-quality mink fur provided from Denmark mink farms. Ultimately, these solutions oppose that of the Prime Minister, along with Staten Serum Institute, who felt that the culling of the entire population was the optimal solution.
It is imperative to view the control of Cluster 5 from a system-wide and optimized policy perspective, as an issue affecting not only the immediate state of global public health, but also the long-term economic and political stability of Denmark. Our recommended policy approach is a 2-stage response and prevention program that incorporates both short-term and long-term strategies. Broadly speaking, the goal of the first stage is to contain and control the Cluster 5 variant while mitigating the severity of economic damage, with supporting activities advancing scientific research and public education. The goal of the second stage is to reduce the future zoonotic risk on mink farms through long-term strategies, disease surveillance, a redesign of regulations, and a gradual reduction of the national mink industry. This logic map expands upon the implementation of Stage 1. To briefly summarize this information, first, national surveillance for Cluster 5 should be established, with testing kits, PPE, and training rapidly deployed to all mink farms. Second, this surveillance system should inform a continually updated 2-ring zone designation, an inner zone consisting of all regions with a detected outbreak and a buffer zone of regions adjacent to detected outbreaks. Mink should be culled on all farms in the inner zone, while lockdowns and transportation bans should be mandated in both the inner and outer zones. In addition, funding of scientific research should be increased, and public educational materials should be developed and distributed.
The Stage 2 logic map focuses on mitigating future risks. First, long-term surveillance will be established by training staff in handling testing and reporting to help contain diseases. Second is to improve regulation for animal living standards. This would encompass requiring staff to wear PPE to mitigate the spread. Minimum cage and living standard requirements for the mink to also mitigate the risk for spread between mink, along with minimum health and safety requirements throughout the farm itself. Lastly, reducing national operations over time. The priority would be achieved by rendering mink farms economically non-viable for select farms, requiring government certification programs and enforcement of regulations.
What are some potential unintended consequences that we can anticipate? In stage 1, the biggest risk is that the cluster 5 variant might not be successfully contained. However, this is a risk that should be mitigated in a balanced way rather than completely eliminated. Also, stage 1 depends on farmers being the ones to perform testing and culling on their own mink. This might actually force farmers into closer contact with infectious mink. Hence, care must be taken to ensure proper distribution of PPE and training and adequate safety procedures for culling and disposal of mink bodies.
Though it is our intention to reduce and eventually eliminate mink farms using strict national guidelines, audits, and penalties, these could disproportionately hurt smaller operations compared to large industrial operations. This will be accounted for using existing systems such as Denmark's unemployment benefits to reduce financial burdens and impacts. These guidelines may also antagonize necessary stakeholders such as Copenhagen fur and mink fur farm owners, but it is worth noting that improved animal welfare standards will actually enhance the quality of mink pelts, thereby driving up pelt prices. These guidelines may also push out the mink fur industry from Denmark to nations that are unreceptive to welfare regulations. But we predict that these nations will adopt similar welfare guidelines to achieve the quality norms that make Denmark's industry so renowned.
Here are our references. Thank you so much for your attention, and please let us know if you have any questions.